So now I can proceed with my presentation. I've called it Demystifying High-Level Radioactive Waste. There's a lot of mystery involved in these concepts because, first of all, what do we mean by radioactive? What do we mean by high level? What do we mean by waste? And why is it so dangerous? So this is a slideshow to cast light on the project that is being proposed for the people of the Treaty Number 3 territory in Northwestern Ontario, which is to take all of Canada's high-level radioactive waste, wherever it may originate, and move it to one location for the purpose of putting it deep underground after repackaging it into what are called burial containers. So the nuclear power industry in Canada has produced so far 3.33 million bundles of nuclear fuel waste. Each one is about the size of a fireplace log, and the total weight is about 60,000 tons. It's actually not a huge amount considering the volume, but it is enormously dangerous and toxic, and that's why they want to put it very deep underground and spend a lot of money doing that. They're going to spend approximately, they estimate, $26 billion. That's an awful lot of money. And OPG, Ontario Power Generation, expects to double this volume over the next 30 years. Now, the fuel bundles, which you see there, a CANDU fuel bundle, those they're so hot that they have to be cooled for at least 10 years in 40 feet of water, which circulates slowly to remove the heat. If that water were not there and were not circulating, the heat would spontaneously, the waste would spontaneously overheat and release radioactive materials into the air or into the water. After 10 years, these fuel bundles can be moved into dry storage containers. You see them there, the white numbers, or 149 is just one of the many, many that they have. And more is produced every day so that they have to know what they're going to be doing with this for the very long term. Now, a CANDU fuel bundle, like one of these, can be handled safely before it is used. But after it's used in a nuclear reactor, it is actually impossible to handle. It'll never be handled by human hands again. It gives a lethal radiation dose in about 20 seconds to anybody who is standing within a meter of the fuel bundle without protection. That's for a fuel bundle that has been freshly discharged from the nuclear reactor. So this is why one has to handle it only with robotic equipment. Robots basically are used, not humans, to handle these materials. Yeah, this is an ad from the Canadian Nuclear Association. The ad is called Small Wonder. The actor is holding up a simulated uranium fuel pellet between his thumb and his finger. And he's saying, isn't it amazing how much energy we can get out of this tiny little amount of uranium? We can get as much energy as you would get from a carload of coal. And yet we would not be releasing into the atmosphere any carbon dioxide in extracting that energy, because this is not a carbon-based fuel. It's so-called nuclear fuel. It does not work by combustion, but by splitting the atoms of uranium and releasing energy in that way. So it's a completely different technology. But what he doesn't say in the ad is that once you have used this little pellet to produce energy, you cannot throw it away. You cannot discard it because it's too dangerous. You have to keep an eye on it for the next 10 million years. And we don't know how to reduce the hazard of this except by natural decay. That is, over a long period of time, it becomes less radioactive and less toxic, but it still remains dangerous for enormous periods of time. Now, where they want to put this waste is right in the very geographical heart of the Treaty 3 area, which is between Dryden and Ignace. And one wonders why on earth this area should be chosen, because the waste was certainly not produced in this region. In fact, this region did not even receive any benefits from the nuclear electricity that was generated down south. It's a different grid. So the electricity that comes to the communities in this region are not really carrying nuclear electricity. So it raises the question, why is such a remote community being selected as a candidate community for putting all the waste? And if it is as safe as they say it is, then what's wrong with leaving it where it was originated? Why not manage it there? Why is it felt necessary to take it so far away from the source? Now, this is the target area. The target area is between Ignace and Dryden, and there already is a kind of a hosting agreement that has already been signed, as I understand it, by the town council of Ignace. And this hosting agreement means that if things proceed, that future town councils, future mayors, will not even be allowed to say anything negative about the project. They will not be able to openly criticize the project. Part of the agreement is to agree to keep any concerns you may have to yourself and not to voice them publicly, which seems like a very strange and undemocratic approach. Perhaps not a very wise approach either. Now, just a little bit about myself. I graduated from the University of Toronto in 1961 with a gold medal in mathematics and physics. My field of study was mathematics, physics, and chemistry. And in fact, at that time, I was even thinking of possibly going into nuclear energy as a field, as a professional, because I was told that it was clean, safe, cheap, and abundant. And I thought, wow, it sounds great. Why would anybody be against it? At that time, I did not even know there was such a thing as radioactive waste from nuclear power. How I learned about it was in 1970, I became the editor of Survival Magazine. This is a magazine devoted to protecting the Earth from dangerous branches of science, including weapons of mass destruction. I learned about the huge tanks of liquid high-level radioactive waste in the United States. 1 million gallons of this high-level radioactive waste had already leaked out into the soil, and I learned that just 1 single gallon of that waste was enough to ruin an entire city's water supply if it was simply dumped into the water supply and stirred around. So that was a big shock to me because I thought nuclear energy was clean. Turns out that that's a big lie. I soon learned that Canada has the same waste in solid form. And there's a process called reprocessing. The waste contains a material called plutonium, which does not exist in nature, but which you can extract from the used fuel of a nuclear reactor. In the United States, they extracted that plutonium and made thousands of nuclear weapons because plutonium is a very powerful nuclear explosive, and it is created inside the nuclear reactor fuel. But in order to get the plutonium out, you have to dissolve the fuel in nitric acid, and that puts everything into a liquid form, and that's where those huge tanks of liquid waste had come from. Now, this made me very concerned, and a lot of other people got very concerned around the middle of the 1970s. In 1974, India exploded an atomic bomb using plutonium from a Canadian nuclear reactor that had been given to them as a gift. And so this immediately revealed to people that there is a connection, a possible connection between nuclear power for peaceful purposes and nuclear bombs for military purposes. Also, the year afterwards, in 1975, there was a bit of a scandal, quite a scandal, about extensive radioactive contamination of more than 100 homes in the town of Port Hope, Ontario, where uranium mined in Saskatchewan and Northern Ontario in Elliott Lake area had been processed by the Port Hope refinery. At that time, the refinery was at Port Hope. It subsequently been moved up to Blind River. So that led to a lot of concern on the part of many people. And in 1975, I and 30 of my colleagues founded an organization called the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. And the purpose of this was simply to share information with people who wanted to have a better understanding of what this material is and why it poses the risks that it does. So for the first 33 years in Canada, the government didn't say anything about nuclear waste, and they led people to believe that there was no problem associated with nuclear power. It was a problem-free technology. In 1945, that long ago, the first reactors were built at Chalk River in Ontario, in the Ottawa River Valley. And so they started producing this high-level radioactive waste, which they called irradiated fuel. They were producing that for 33 years before there was any official acknowledgement publicly that this could constitute a problem. In fact, in 1975, when the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility was formed, we were one of the first in Canada to point out that there is no acceptable long-term plan for handling this irradiated fuel, this high-level radioactive waste. So in 1977, a few years later, the federal government finally issued a report called Managing Canada's Nuclear Waste, and they recommended a deep geological underground repository for storing this material. In 1978, the Porter Commission report, that's a Royal Commission report in Ontario on the electric power planning for the province. They published a separate volume called A Race Against Time about nuclear power alone in Ontario, and they said that actually, they believe that no more nuclear reactors should be built if the problem cannot be shown to be solved. So this put the nuclear industry under a kind of an ultimatum that you better prove that this problem can be solved. Otherwise, you cannot proceed to build more reactors. That was the basic message that came out of the Porter Commission. Now, it turns out that when AECL, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, was given a lot of money, $750 million, as it turned out, over many years to pursue research into this question of how do we prove that nuclear waste can be safely put underground and that it won't leak out and contaminate the water or the air or the soil or the food chain. And they went to Northwestern Ontario and tried to get permission to drill for testing at many, many places in Northern Ontario, including Atikokan, including Massey on the North Shore of Georgian Bay, numerous communities where they wanted to do test drilling, but none of these Northwestern Ontario communities wanted them to do the drilling there because they figured that if they did the drilling, chances are they would end up getting the waste as well, and they didn't really want the waste. So in 1980, AECL went over to Manitoba, and they chose a site for an underground research laboratory in Manitoba near Lac du Bonnet. I've indicated it there on the map. The URL stands for Underground Research Laboratory, and it was administered by the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited laboratories at Pinawa in Manitoba on the Winnipeg River. So they built an underground research laboratory, and they had a 10-year environmental assessment of the project. And that assessment was called the Seaborne Commission. And they're the ones who basically advised the government of Canada that what we really need in order to secure the safety of this going forward is we need to have an independent agency that is independent from the nuclear industry. And it should have representation from various stakeholders, including Indigenous people and municipalities and so on, to guide the research and the implementation of any plan for dealing with this radioactive waste. Unfortunately, even though this report was filed in 1998, the Chrétien government, Prime Minister Chrétien was Prime Minister at that time, and they did not accept this recommendation. They instead told the nuclear industry to make its own organization, and that's the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, or NWMO, which is completely owned by the people who actually make the waste, which are Ontario Power Generation, Hydro-Quebec in Quebec, and New Brunswick Power in New Brunswick. Those are the only provinces that have nuclear reactors. In Quebec, they've all been shut down. We don't have any operating reactors anymore in Quebec for power generation, but they do have one in New Brunswick, and they're thinking about building some new ones going forward. Now, here's what the Underground Research Laboratory looked like back in 1984. I visited the Underground Research Laboratory, went down into it, and this is where they want to put the high-level radioactive waste. Of course, they say that they want to put it into an undisturbed geological formation, one that has been undisturbed for many millions of years, thinking that if they put the waste down there, it'll probably be safe for another million years. But what they don't take into consideration when talking to the public is that you can't put the waste into an undisturbed geological formation without first disturbing it. You've got to dig it up. You've got to open it up with a shaft. You have to excavate caverns in there. So it's no longer an undisturbed formation when you do all that work. And that includes blasting too. So cracks are formed that weren't there before, and passageways are formed that weren't there before, by which possibly there could be infiltration. I also asked the people when I was visiting this site, I noticed they had pumps working all the time, pumping the water out. And I said, if you turned off the pumps, how long would it take for this repository to completely fill up with water? And they said, oh, maybe a week or two, but it'll definitely fill up with water. So that's a concern because water is going to be present in these underground workings. Now, what I learned, what I learned after looking into it is, and I think these are important things to realize. The first point is that the used nuclear fuel bundles themselves are not the waste. They are just the containers of the waste. So it's what inside those fuel bundles that is really the waste. And those are the things that can leak out. Nuclear wastes are not leftover uranium fuel, but hundreds of newly created radioactive poisons inside the fuel. So the strange thing to realize here is that the fuel bundles that go into the reactor could be handled safely using gloves. You could actually hold one in your hand. But once it comes out of the reactor, it'll never be handled by human hands again. It comes out, it's millions of times more radioactive than when it went in. And that's not because of the uranium, it's because of all the byproducts of uranium fission, which are called the fission products. And these fission products are fiercely radioactive, and they're so radioactive that they even generate a lot of heat. Another thing that's important to realize is that any physical damage of the used fuel bundles will allow releases of radioactive gases, vapors, liquids, or particles. So handling the used fuel bundles, once they're that radioactive, like, for example, repackaging them into burial containers, this is a little bit hazardous because any damage, just a crack or a pinhole or any kind of greater damage, risks the escape of radioactive contamination into the environment. So that's an important thing because according to NWMO, they want to do the repackaging not where the waste was produced back south, but up north where they're going to be burying it. So when you handle these fuel bundles, any damage that is caused to them will cause releases of radioactive materials. There's something else that's particularly worrisome to myself, and this goes back to my understanding about those liquid waste I mentioned in the United States, is that if you want to get plutonium out of the fuel before you bury it, then you have to destroy the used fuel bundles. That's the only way you can get the plutonium out. And when you destroy the fuel bundles, you either have to dissolve it in an acid or otherwise break it apart completely. When you break a fuel bundle apart completely, you liberate the radioactive waste that are inside. So this is a very particularly dangerous operation. And in fact, the only sites on Earth where they have done a lot of reprocessing over many years are among the most radioactively contaminated sites on Earth. They include Hanford, Washington, in the United States, in Washington State. They did that for the purpose of making bombs. They would not do that in Canada because we don't make bombs, but we do have people who would like to use the plutonium as a fuel for more nuclear reactors. And therefore, they would like to get the plutonium out, not for military purposes, but for civilian purposes. Whatever the purpose is, it's a very dangerous process and it results in a lot of radioactive contamination. And that's why I believe that the communities up north should be very concerned. I would think that if you were in the driver's seat, you should probably be telling NWMO that you do not want any handling of the used fuel bundles up here. any handling should be done down where you are, down where the experts are, down where the money is, down where the expertise is. You should put this waste into burial containers before you bring it up here. That way we don't have to handle it. We can just put it underground directly. So that's an important consideration. Unfortunately, that right is not enshrined in the hosting agreement that has already been signed. So it's something that maybe Treaty 3 people might want to say, listen, we did not agree to this. We have to open up that agreement and ensure that that we have our rights respected and that we do not contaminate our own environment by unnecessary handling of the used fuel. Now, it all comes back to the atomic theory. Back in the 19th century, in the 1800s, they didn't even know for sure whether atoms existed, but now we know that everything is made up of tiny little atoms, and every atom has a tiny core called the nucleus. The nucleus is at the center, and around it there are orbiting electrons that go around. It turns out that nuclear energy refers to energy that comes directly from the nucleus of the atom. And what we've discovered, what science has discovered, is that the forces that hold the nucleus of an atom together are the strongest forces in the entire universe. And when that energy is released, it's enormous energy. That's why just a small pellet of uranium is able to give as much energy as a carload of coal. And that's why if you make a bomb out of uranium, you can destroy an entire city, such as the Allies did in 1945, August 6, 1945, for the city of Hiroshima. And again, on August 9th, the city of Nagasaki, both cities in Japan. The second bomb, the first bomb was made of highly enriched uranium. The second bomb was made of this man-made material, this human-made material called plutonium, which is only created inside nuclear reactors. Now, here's a model of the uranium atom. This is actually from Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It's a photo taken by my friend Robert Del Tredici, and it shows the electronic sphere, the sphere of the electrons, and the nucleus is right at the center there. Uranium turns out to be the key element behind all nuclear fission technology. It's the only element in nature that can be used to make an atomic bomb or to fuel a nuclear reactor. And of course, this leads to uranium mining. And all of that power comes from the nucleus of the atom. Here's a monument to the splitting of the atom. This is a monument from Russia, and it sort of illustrates the two little hemispheres there in the two slabs of stone represent the split pieces of a uranium atom. And when the uranium atom is split to release the energy inside, you get all those broken pieces. And all those broken pieces are the radioactive waste. They become the so-called fission products, and they are much more radioactive than uranium itself. And that's the accumulation of these fission products is what makes the radioactive waste so much more dangerous than the fresh fuel. Those semicircles on both sides indicate the energy. They symbolize the energy that's given off. And the statue in front is the statue of a man called Kurchatov, who is known as the father of the Soviet atomic bomb. So nuclear fuel waste, therefore, contains three categories of radioactive waste materials. The main category that I have talked about is the category of fission products. These are the broken bits of uranium atoms. There are other elements created called transuranics. Transuranic means beyond uranium. It means heavier than uranium. Transuranics include plutonium, which I've already mentioned to you, and half a dozen other materials called americium, neptunium, curium, and several others. These are things that are not found on nature, which are created inside the reactor. They're heavier than uranium elements that are created when some of the uranium atoms absorb neutrons without splitting, and they just become heavier and turn into new elements. And then there's another category called activation products. It turns out that the stray neutrons that are given off from a nuclear reaction, when they hit non-radioactive atoms in the concrete and the steel and the water and even the air, they can make those non-radioactive materials into radioactive materials. And so the steel becomes radioactive, the concrete becomes radioactive, the water becomes radioactive. And this happens because of the nuclear fission process with all those neutrons being given off. Now, here's a list from Atomic Energy of Canada Limited of some of the selected radionuclides that you find in high-level radioactive waste. And there's a whole lot of them, and they're listed here. This is not a complete list, but it goes on and on and on. And these are all radioactive versions of things in nature which are not radioactive. For example, silver. In the middle here, you see silver. Silver is not radioactive. But what the nuclear reactor does is it creates radioactive versions of silver. So while silver atoms are stable and they're just behave themselves like silver, the radioactive versions of silver are dangerous because those atoms are unstable and they explode. That's what a radioactive atom is. A radioactive atom is one that is so unstable that it will explode. And when it explodes, it's called a disintegration. It gives off a certain amount of subatomic shrapnel, and that can damage living cells. And in particular, it can make them in such a way, it can damage them in such a way that they grow incorrectly. And those damaged cells, if they're not able to heal themselves, they could develop into cancers years later. So look at all these elements. This is 211 elements that are inside every irradiated uranium fuel bundle. Its list of 211 radionuclides is by no means complete. And this list, by the way, is already 10 years after the fuel has been removed from the reactor. So it's a very long-lived problem. You've heard of these nuclear accidents that occur, hopefully not here in Canada, but there was one in the United States. Oh, actually, there was one in Canada in 1952. There was a small research reactor that actually exploded and had a partial meltdown. That was in 1952 at Chalk River with AECL. You've heard of the one in Fukushima. This is a picture of one of those reactors in Fukushima in Japan exploding. And what makes these accidents dangerous is not the explosion itself. That, of course, could injure workers. But the explosion is not what damages society. What damages society is the release of the radioactive materials that we've been talking about. It's when those radioactive materials are given off into the air, then they fall out onto the ground and they become radioactive contamination. Here's the damage. And by the way, this damage, this explosion that caused this damage was actually caused by the radioactive waste itself. It wasn't caused by any external agency. It was not a bomb that caused this damage. It was the overheating of the irradiated fuel inside the reactor, leading to chemical explosions and releases of radioactive materials, because in some cases, the fuel, three of the 6 reactors, the fuel actually melted spontaneously under the heat of radioactivity. And this is how contaminated the Japanese area was. This is part of the island of Japan and extends approximately 250 kilometers in the furthest direction. The actual reactor was where that symbol is up here. You see that symbol there? That's where the reactor was, the Fukushima reactor. The radioactive materials were spread all over and contaminated the soil, and all of that had to be cleaned up. So here is an example of where they were cleaning up some of this waste. All those garbage bags, those blue garbage bags, are full of radioactively contaminated soil that was dug out of the forests and out of the gardens and out of the lawns of people living in that whole vast area. And those brown things underneath are just bags that were covered up with earth. Each one of those layers is a similar layer of radioactive waste that has been gathered together because it was, first of all, scattered by the accident. Now, here are some of the large tanks of water. This is radioactively contaminated water from the nuclear accident. They had over 1,000 of these tanks, accumulating to approximately 1 million tons of radioactively contaminated water, which they accumulated over the last 20 years or so since the accident. And they're now have received permission to gradually dump this water into the Pacific Ocean over the objections of some of the local residents and over the objections of the government of China and the government of South Korea. Nevertheless, they feel that they need to dump this water into the Pacific Ocean because they're running out of space to actually store the radioactively contaminated water from the reactor accident. What I want to emphasize here is that all of this radioactive material, which they're dumping and storing, came from the irradiated nuclear fuel. That's what's in the irradiated nuclear fuel. That's what's making nuclear accidents dangerous. Now, here's a CANDU reactor. We are fortunate that no CANDU reactor has suffered any such accident. The reactor core is where the fuel is. And you can see that device there called a steam generator. That's where the heat from the core is used to boil water. And the water produces steam, and that steam goes to what's called a turbine building. And there they spin the blades of a turbine, they make it rotate very rapidly, and they generate electricity that way. So in this point of view, nuclear energy is really just another way to boil water, but that boiling water can produce steam, and that steam can generate electricity. And so that's where we get a lot of useful power for industry and domestic use. Now, because the irradiated fuel is in the core, you would think that all the rest of the reactor should be non-radioactive, because it's only in the core that the atoms are being split. It's only in the core that radioactivity is being created, that these new radioactive materials are being created. But even though a fuel bundle looks solid, it can leak. If there's little cracks or little pinholes, any kind of little leak will allow some of those materials to escape. If they escape from the fuel, they get into the water, and then they go up to the steam generator. And here's a steam generator that was taken out of the Bruce reactors. It weighs 100 tons. It never came in contact with the irradiated fuel directly. Nevertheless, it is radioactively contaminated. And here's a list of all the radioactive materials they found in this one steam generator. On the right-hand side, you see the radioactive silver, the radioactive americium, carbon, curium, cobalt, cesium. These are materials which are iron 55, iodine 129. These are materials which are not radioactive in nature, but they have become radioactive in the nuclear reactor. So you might say that they're kind of radioactive twins of substances in nature that are not radioactive. So there they are. And that's right inside the steam generator. How did it get there? It got there because the fuel bundles leak. And that's what we're worried about underground. We're worried that underground they could leak as well. And even above ground, if you're going to handle these fuel, don't forget this fuel is about 30 years old already. It's been stored for about 30 years. Who knows what kind of corrosion there has been? When you take the fuel bundles out of those containers, they may very well have some cracks, some leaks, some pinholes, and that can lead to contamination. Not, of course, the kind of contamination that you would get from a large nuclear accident, but nevertheless, worrisome enough to necessitate very, very careful handling and very, very careful disposal and storage. So a fuel bundle looks solid, but radioactive materials do leak out through tiny pinholes and cracks. If there's severe fuel damage, like if it was absolutely crushed, then you would have massive leaks of material. Fuel suffers corrosion, distortion, and embrittlement in the reactor. Embrittlement means instead of being really strong like steel normally is, it's more likely to fracture or crack under stress. Back at the nuclear generating station, when they take the irradiated fuel out of the pool, remember they put it in the pool for 10 years? When they take that fuel out of the pool, they can put it into a dry storage container. This is what the inside of a dry storage container looks like. Now, the amazing thing about this is that this flask, this cask, it's called a dry storage cask. When it's empty, it weighs 60 tons, 60 tons. When it's full, it weighs 70 tons. So that means that this 60-ton container holds only 10 tons of irradiated fuel. And you might ask yourself, my goodness, why is the container so big? Well, the reason why is because they don't want any leakage of any of those materials. That's why it's so big. They don't want the radioactivity or the radioactive materials to find a pathway by which they can escape. So the top is welded shut, and that's a structural weld up there here, all around the top. And there's also a seal. It's called a safeguard seal, and that is inspected by international inspectors that come from other countries. There is plutonium in all these fuel bundles, and that plutonium can be used to make atomic bombs. And this seal is to guarantee that nobody has taken the fuel out and enabled them to steal the plutonium for being able to make bombs. They do these inspections all over the world, wherever there are nuclear power plants. And in fact, if you look at this 10 tons of fuel, that would contain about 40 kilograms of plutonium, which is enough for 6 or 7 atomic bombs. So there's enough plutonium in each one of these dry storage casks for 6 or 7 atomic bombs. And because plutonium is very, very long-lived, it has what's called a half-life of 24,000 years. It means that it'll take 24,000 years for just half of the plutonium to disappear by radioactive disintegration. So that means that after 24,000 years, you'll only have enough for about 3 or 4 bombs, not 6 or 7 bombs. But still, as you can see, it's an ongoing problem. Now, when they take the spent fuel out of the dry storage cask, they want to put it into a transportation container. And the transportation container, this is only done, by the way, using robots. It is not done by human hands. It's done by cranes, which are robotically operated. And they're put into a package, which is a stainless steel package. And I'm told that stainless steel package is about 30 centimeters thick. Again, why is it so thick? Well, again, they don't want any of this stuff to get out. That's why. So they're taking every precaution they can think of to try and ensure that it's not going to escape. Of course, if the fuel was damaged before it went into the container, then there would be releases of radioactivity from those damaged fuel bundles. But they will look after that at the station site. They will make sure that any damaged fuel bundles are put aside and dealt with very, very carefully. So the transportation vehicles will have a lot of padding, and they will take this heavily reinforced stainless steel package of spent fuel up to the burial site. These are official diagrams from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization done by SNC-Lavalin, an engineering company. Now, the used fuel has to be repackaged when it arrives at the DGR site, and this is what I am concerned about. I don't think they should do any repackaging. What they do at the site of the DGR is they take the spent fuel out of those transport containers. Individual bundles have to be taken out, and they have to be manipulated behind about 3 feet thick of leaded glass. These glass windows are 3 feet thick. And again, that's to make sure that none of the material escapes from the fuel while they're handling it. They don't handle it with human hands. They use robot arms, and that's what those things above are. These are robot arms which they manipulate in order to take the fuel out of the transport containers and put them into these things, which are called the burial containers. Now, the burial containers are only about 2.5 meters long and 0.5 meter wide. And they have to put all those fuel bundles, 48 of them, inside that very tight container. And then they have to weld the top onto that. My question is, why would that be done in a remote community like Ignace, or a remote community like Revel Lake? Or why would it be done? Why would this not be done where the waste was first created? They should, in my opinion, they should take this waste and repackage it before they ship it anywhere. So it should be in those safety packages before shipping rather than after shipping. And I believe that if a community were able to reach an agreement with NWMO that they would be willing to sign, they should say that, well, we need to have certain clauses in there that give us protection against our own community being contaminated. Of course, they don't intend to contaminate it, but it can happen by accident. Let's just not take any chances. Do all that packaging beforehand. And of course, the materials, when they do leak out, they can go everywhere. They can get into the food chain. They can get into the drinking water. They can get into the air we breathe. And of course, that's where it gets into your body. And when it gets into your body, then you have atoms inside your body that are literally exploding and giving off this kind of subatomic shrapnel, which can damage the cells of the body and cause harmful consequences such as cancer. Now, it turns out that there's here are just a few of those radioactive materials, and it shows you which parts of the body they go to when they're in the food or the water or the air. They go into different organs of the body depending upon how the body, you see, when the body gets radioactive iodine in its food, it doesn't know it's radioactive. The body thinks it's just ordinary iodine. And so it takes it to where the ordinary iodine goes to, which is to the thyroid gland up here in the throat. And when it gets up in the thyroid gland, it does start exploding and causing damage to the thyroid. As a result of this, there were about 5,000 children in Belarus who had to have their thyroid glands surgically removed after the accident in Chernobyl. Chernobyl was the nuclear reactor in the Ukraine, which exploded, you remember, way back in 1986, and gave off a lot of radioactive material all over Northern Europe and even across the ocean. In Canada, the Inuit people were the ones who got the highest doses of radioactive fallout from the Chernobyl accident, as they did from the bomb testing as well. And the reason why is because the Inuit people eat a lot of caribou meat, and the caribou eat a lot of lichen, and the lichen are very good at concentrating radioactive fallout. So the caribou end up with a lot of radioactive fallout in their bodies, and the Inuit, who eat a lot of caribou, end up with a similar amount of radioactive fallout in their bodies, and this is not healthy for them. So what is radioactivity? Well, most atoms are stable, unchanging, eternal. But a radioactive atom is unstable. It explodes, it disintegrates, and they even measure it by talking about how many disintegrations per second there are. When it disintegrates, it damages nearby living cells by throwing off a kind of subatomic shrapnel called atomic radiation, 1 or 2 projectiles at a time. The half-life of any radioactive material is the time it takes for half of the atoms to explode or disintegrate. Now, there is a small handful of naturally occurring radioactive elements. Uranium itself is radioactive, as is thorium, but there are hundreds of human-made radioactive elements that were never found in nature before 1939. So what is radioactivity? Here's a picture of the nucleus of a radioactive atom. And when it disintegrates, it gives off 2 or 3 projectiles. Those projectiles can be material charged particles, alpha or beta particles, or it could be a burst of an invisible ray similar to an X-ray, which is called gamma radiation. And all 3 of these types of emissions can happen from uranium and from its byproducts. Now, here's a picture in a device called a cloud chamber. You can't see or smell or taste radioactivity, but if you put the radioactive material, this lump of uranium ore, into a cloud chamber, you can see the tracks that are left by these radioactive materials. And you can see that all these radioactive emissions, these radioactive projectiles, are coming off that rock in great abundance. That's because this is quite a radioactive sample. And the amazing thing is that this release of energy goes on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for millions of years, even billions of years, without ever slowing down, except very, very, very gradually, imperceptibly over 1 million years, you would notice hardly any change. So you look at this and you say, wow, where is all that energy coming from? Well, you know what it is? It's nuclear energy. It's energy from the nucleus of the atom, which is unstable, and therefore it leaks some of that nuclear energy out. And that is what radioactivity is. Radioactivity is the leakage of nuclear energy. It's a form of nuclear energy that cannot be shut off. We don't know how to shut off radioactivity. That's why we have a radioactive waste problem. Now, chronic exposure to radioactive materials increases the incidence of cancer, leukemia, and genetic damage. Genetic damage means damage to the eggs and sperm the reproductive cells. This won't happen if that material doesn't get into your body. But if the radioactivity does get into your body, then this damage can be done then. And it can be done very slowly over many years in a chronic means repeated exposure to low levels. It can also cause anemia. In fact, that's what killed Madame Curie and her daughter Irene Curie. She's the one who discovered radium, one of the uranium byproducts. It can also damage the immune system, and that makes you more prone to catch all kinds of communicable diseases. Strokes, heart attacks, and low intelligence are also caused by chronic exposure to radioactivity. There is a latency period, which means that this doesn't happen right away. It happens over many, many years. So sometimes it may take 10, 20, or 30 years before the increase in cancers are observed. So it's a population that's really the target of low-level radiation. And if you have radioactive material in the environment, then it goes, a little bit goes everywhere. You get it into the food, you get it into the fish, the vegetables, the air, and the bodies of the people. They're not all going to get cancer, but some of them will. A small fraction of the population will develop cancer years later. Infants and children are especially sensitive. They're especially vulnerable to radioactive damage. And it turns out that women are about twice as vulnerable as men to the same level of radiation exposure. Now, if you have a larger population exposed to the very same level of contamination, then we say the population dose is greater, even though the individual doses are not any different. The individual doses are just what they were before, but there's larger number of people involved. In that case, you see more cancers. So the number of cancers are depending upon the number of people who are exposed. And of course, as time goes on, populations do grow sometimes, and you get large populations where before there were only small populations. So this is a concern going forward for a long, long time into the future. Okay, here's a statement from 1976. I'm going to wind up pretty soon so that we can have lots of questions, okay? In 1976, do you remember that it was only in 1975 that the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility was formed? And I only learned about radioactive waste in 1970. Even though I had a degree in science, I was nobody ever told me that there was radioactive waste from nuclear power. So I had to find this out for myself. Well, in 1976, a nuclear physicist in England called Sir Brian Flowers, who worked on both nuclear weapons and nuclear power reactors, he wrote a report called a Royal Commission report for the British government. And one of his conclusions was that we are agreed that it would be irresponsible and morally wrong to commit future generations to the consequences of fission power on a massive scale until it has been demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that at least one method exists for the safe isolation of these wastes for the indefinite future. So this is exactly what motivated NWMO to try and find such a solution. Here's a report to the US Congress 1 year later in 1977. The growth of nuclear power in the United States is threatened. Now notice that. It's not people, but the growth of nuclear power that is threatened. The growth of nuclear power is threatened by the problem of how to safely dispose of radioactive waste, potentially dangerous to human life. Nuclear power critics, the public, business leaders, and government officials all concur that a solution to the disposal problem is critical to the continued growth of nuclear energy. Now, I want you to think about that statement because it seems to express more concern for the future of nuclear energy than it does for the health of people. In other words, the disposal of radioactive waste is really a giant public relations problem for the nuclear industry. And that's why the Seaborne panel, remember the Seaborne panel, the one that did the environmental assessment of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's geologic disposal concept, they recommended that there had to be an independent waste management agency, an agency that was not connected to the nuclear industry because they did not want to have a conflict of interest. They did not want the people who were looking after safety, looking after the safety of humans and the environment, they didn't want them to have any ties to the nuclear industry because then they might say, well, you know, we got to look after our bosses, the nuclear industry, and make sure that they're okay. And if if this is going to be a problem for them, then we're not doing our job. So that's the reason why, in order to avoid a conflict of interest, we should have an independent agency, which we do not have at the present time, even though we've asked repeatedly for the government of Canada to create such an agency. When I say we, this is over 100 public interest groups from across Canada who participated 2 years ago in the development of Canada's new radioactive waste policy. I'll just mention in 1978, the report A Race Against Time came out from the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning. And it said, we need, again, an independent panel of experts. The word independent is there again. If adequate progress is not being made, say by 1985, the nuclear power should be reassessed, and a moratorium, that means a halt to additional nuclear stations, should be considered. This graph was produced by the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning. These graphs are always very hard to read. On the bottom scale, you have time, and it goes from 1 year after removal of the spent fuel from a reactor all the way up to 10 million years. That 10 to the power 7 at the end there on the bottom, that represents 10 million years. And this waste remains dangerous for more than 10 million years. In fact, the blue line represents the total toxicity. That means the danger to humans and living things. And it actually goes down for the first 100,000 years. And then, surprisingly enough, it goes back up again a little bit. And the reason why is because as these atoms are disintegrating, they're also creating new radioactive atoms that weren't there before. And some of these new ones that are created are actually more dangerous than the ones that were previously there. The amount of water needed to dissolve just 1 year's worth of radioactive waste from just one CANDU reactor, that's just 1 year from one CANDU reactor, you'd need the amount of water which is equivalent to the volume of Lake Superior to dissolve that waste to a level which would be legally allowed for people to drink. In other words, anything smaller than the volume of Lake Superior would not be enough to give you drinkable water. That just is meant to show you how dangerous this material potentially is. And it's why everybody, including the people in the nuclear industry and the people out of the nuclear industry, are working as hard as they can to make sure that none of this material actually gets out into the environment, or very little of it, as little as possible. I just want to mention one other alternative, which is important, and that is, the question is, well, do we really need to bury this stuff? And the answer is no, we don't. We can keep it safely where it is, and we can bury it in shallow, it doesn't have to go so very deep. The only reason they want to put it so very deep is because they want to be able to abandon it. They want to be able to walk away from it and say, okay, our job is done. It's not our problem anymore. It's your problem. But we believe, my organization believes, that we have an obligation to look after this waste and not to bury it, not to put it out of human control. Now, actually, the Anishinaabe-Iroquois Alliance on Radioactive Waste made a joint declaration in 2017 in which they laid down 5 principles for radioactive waste. And that included no abandonment. Radioactive waste materials are so dangerous, they cannot be put out beyond human control. They can't be forgotten. Secondly, it has to be monitored and retrievable. You have to be able to measure what's happening, detect any possible release, and then retrieve it if it needs retrieving. If it needs repair, you need to be able to make the repairs. Thirdly, better containment and more packaging with labeling. Fourthly, very important, away from major water bodies. That means away from major sources of drinking water. As we know, water is sacred. It's the essence of life itself. And also no imports or exports of radioactive waste. It should be dealt with as much as possible where it is created. Now, of course, in the case of the NWMO project, they will be importing this waste into Treaty Region 3, where it was never produced in the first place. So it's a form of import. It's not importing it from another country, but it is importing it from a region which has nuclear power to a region which does not have nuclear power. So that's going to be where I leave it for the time being, and we'll open the floor to questions.